have applications. Thank you. And we have applications to neuroscience with Devika Narayan and Bas, her master's student in the Netherlands at Erasmus campus. I did want to just give a brief overview of what my research group does at UCSD. So we mostly develop methods for geometric representation learning, where our assumption is that data in the world, whether it's samples or features or both, lie on a graph, and we're leveraging these relationships between our samples, between our features, in order to extract information from high-dimensional real-world data. So the talk today is going to be about nonlinear manifold learning. We also work on multi-way analysis, so analysis of tensors, develop techniques for graph signal processing. So this is the extension of kind of classical signal processing to non-regular data lying on grids, lying on graphs and networks, geometric deep learning, and all of this has a foundation in spectral graph theory. And our research group mostly collaborates with neuroscientists, and neuroscience, in a sense, was one of the motivating goals for this project. So I'll give a brief introduction for our low-dimensional embedding techniques, define some measures of evaluation that exist in the field, which are local distortion, and then I'll go into the components of our approach, which is constructing local views and then stitching these together in order to obtain a global embedding. And we've also developed a new evaluation measure, which we call global distortion, in order to measure the quality of different low-dimensional embeddings. And finally, our extension to the neuroscience domain. So as I mentioned, the motivation is coming from neuroscience, where we have large-scale neural recordings. This is an example of calcium imaging, where what they do is they can open a window into an animal's brain, and the neurons fluoresce as they fire. So we can take videos of the neurons as they are firing in the brain while an animal is awake and performing certain behaviors. So we now have collections of hundreds of neurons and their time series. And we want to be able to extract information from this large-scale high-dimensional data. So one of the ways to do that is manifold learning, where the assumption is despite the data being high-dimensional, so despite every sample being represented by a very large number of features, intrinsically, there's actually very few variables or parameters that control the appearance of this data. And the function between the intrinsic variables and the observations that we have is nonlinear. And what we'd like to do is to recover the underlying representation of the low-dimensional manifolds from the data while we're preserving certain geometric properties. And a lot of methods that do this embed the data with the top eigenvectors of different matrices on the data. For example, the covariance matrix gives us PCA, and different variants of the graph Laplacian can give us classical techniques like Laplacian eigenmaps and diffusion maps. And there's been many more research in this field, with UMAP and TSNE being very popular, especially in biological fields recently. Specifically in neuroscience, the study of these manifold structures allows us to recover, for example, what is the geometry of neural activity in the brain. So one of the data sets that we'll see later on is called head direction, and it's the activity of certain neurons determining in which way an animal is looking at. And unsurprisingly, this neural activity lies on some kind of ring structure. Manifold learning also allows us to compare the same behavior across different brain regions and see how these behaviors are encoded, allows us to compare the neural activity, population neural activity across animals. And another data set that we'll also see later on is another navigation circuit, which is the encoding of physical space. So these neurons fire when you're in certain locations, and then from this neural activity, we can recover what is the space that the animal was moving around in. And you can imagine that if we're trying to understand how the brain is encoding certain physical properties like time and space, then we would like our embeddings to have very little distortion, right? We don't want to distort the distances between data points in low dimensions, because then we don't know if the encoding isn't representing the behavior in the animal or the stimuli to a good degree because of an artifact of the method, or because there's some intrinsic distortion in the brain that's happening due to some kind of processing. And we'd like to understand that. So if we're able to embed with low distortion and not have artifacts in our approach, we're better to better understand what is the relationship between the observations that we observe and the latent variables within a system. So I mentioned manifold learning multiple times. Maybe this doesn't need to be defined, but it's a topological space that locally resembles Euclidean space near each point. So in one dimensions, this can be a line or a circle. We only need the angle in order to represent a closed loop. And then in two dimensions, this can be a flat plane, the sphere or the torus, and we'll see these objects later on. But typically also when I'm giving this talk, for example, to neuroscientists, the example that I like to give is that the surface of the Earth is a manifold. And the important thing to note is that when we're here at the University of Minnesota and we step out of the building, then everything is locally flat. If I need to calculate distances, I can take distances in Euclidean space. But as we zoom out, and I, for example, am going to fly back to San Diego tonight, or I was coming from the Netherlands last week, then I need to start taking into account the geometry of the space that I'm in and the fact that I'm on a curved surface in order to calculate distances. So I need to take into account that curvature when I'm traveling. And cartographers, for example, when they want to represent the Earth, what they will do is they will take this three-dimensional object, this closed manifold, and they will tear it apart in order to embed it into two-dimensional intrinsic coordinates, right? There are only two dimensions that mostly matter when we're navigating the Earth, if we're ignoring height for a second, but different cartographic projections incur different distortions in them. Somebody should perhaps mention this to Trump with respect to Greenland. So tearing a manifold and embedding it into intrinsic dimensions can result in different distance distortions or area distortions. And this is one of the things that we're going to introduce in our approach is the tearing of closed manifold in order to recover intrinsic parameters in intrinsic dimensionality. And the other thing that we can do is say that you are now given a map of the Earth. So you're given a two-dimensional atlas, and you'd like to be able to tell whether the Earth is actually a three-dimensional ellipsoid or whether we live on flat Earth. So we'll be able to tell these two scenarios apart with our approach. So just as a bit of an overview, we divide manifold learning frameworks into two, where the majority of methods lie in the first camp, which we consider top-down approaches. So in these approaches, we have some kind of initial global embedding of the data, for example, via the eigendecomposition of a graph matrix, as I mentioned. And then optionally, we can refine this iteratively by minimizing a measure of local distortion. So this, for example, is what Mishne and UMAP do. Mishne starts out, UMAP starts out with some kind of spectral embedding. They add noise and then they iteratively refine it. And you can see in this case, we have what's called a Swiss roll with a hole, a Swiss roll being a manifold learner's best friend with UMAP. And this isn't cherry picked. Many, many times we get this kind of twist in the Swiss roll when we try to recover the original manifold. And I'll talk about that. In the bottom-up camp, what we do is that we first calculate local views with low distortion. So for each point, we'll actually try to find some kind of parametrization, and then we'll align these views to each other in order to recover a global embedding. So this is previously done by methods like LTSA, and we've developed two such techniques called LDLE, which is low distortion local eigenmaps, and RATS, which is Riemannian alignment of tangent spaces, and I'll be talking about both today. So this, for example, is with LDLE. We have some kind of initialization of our global embedding, which I'll touch on, and then we iteratively refine it, and we're able to get a good 2D parameterization, including the geometry of the circular hole. And then in terms of embedding in intrinsic dimensions, so as I mentioned, a ring or any kind of closed loop, the intrinsic dimensionality is 1, though these might be observed in 2 dimensions or in higher dimensions. And a sphere is actually a 2-dimensional object, but observed in 3 dimensions. And then when we take either a sphere or a torus whose intrinsic dimension is 2, and we give it to a range of different manifold learning techniques and tell them to embed it in 2 dimensions, what happens is that they all kind of collapse in 2-dimensional space, aside from Mishne, and I'll touch on Mishne a bit later on. So we're not able to tell, for example, if what I'm doing is I'm embedding, again, the Earth in 2 dimensions using a method like LTSA or UMAP, then Australia and China become very, very close to each other. And I have distorted the distances in the high dimensional space to low distances in my low dimensional embeddings. So let's touch on distortion for a moment. Local distortion is the product of expansion and contraction, which in the worst case scenario is the maximum of the ratio between the distance in the embedding and the distance in the ambient space, and vice versa. And this is a measure that is translation and rotation invariant and scale invariant. So distortion is 1 if and only if the distances in the low dimensional space are just a scaled version of the ambient distances. So for example, I take this small ball and I scale it in all directions by 2, then there's no distortion. But if I'm pulling it as an ellipsoid, then I have higher and higher distance distortions. And if we look at different techniques where we have high aspect ratio, and this has been studied by others before us, for example, taking a very high aspect rectangle and trying to embed it. So UMAP will, for example, twist this rectangle, probably due to this noise that they're adding. It's causing this kind of distortion in the direction. This is a bit outdated. Mishne no longer does this, but Mishne, they used to have a random initialization, and it would basically result that if you had a continuous manifold, it would break it up into a bunch of chunks, and you didn't know how these chunks were related to each other. So if you use random initialization in Mishne, just know that you might end up with this. Currently, the default is also a spectral initialization like UMAP. And then with Laplacian eigenmaps, we can see that it kind of collapses on itself. So we have representation of one of the dimensions, but not of the second. And we also kind of have this curvature that didn't exist in the original data. So these are kind of different distortions that we can observe with different manifold learning techniques. So to start talking about our approach, how do we construct local views and how do we get at a low distortion embedding? So our assumption, again, is that we have data in high dimensions that intrinsically lies on some kind of low dimensional manifold. And this is common in real world data. Videos, audios, images, and so on have been shown to lie on low dimensional manifolds due to different constraints on degrees of freedoms, for example. What we'll do then is we'll take for every point its local neighborhood. And then for each of these local neighborhoods, we'll construct local views with low distortion, where we have currently 2 different approaches for this. We can use local PCA, which is also what LTSA does, developed by Zhang and Zhao, and also what our new method RATS does. Or we can use the Laplacian eigenvectors, which is what I'll touch on briefly today. In terms of future work, we're actually developing a new technique to address local view construction under non-Gaussian noise. I don't know if I'll have time to touch on that, but there's further work to be explored in this direction. So in terms of the construction of local views, we build on a result from Jones, Maggioni, and Schul in 2007, where in the continuous scenario, they proved the existence of low distortion parameterizations of small metric balls on a Riemannian manifold using the global eigenfunctions of the Laplacian. So if you have the Laplace-Beltrami operator on your manifold, they can find 4 different metric balls on the manifold. They have a procedure by which they choose subsets of eigenvectors of the Laplace-Beltrami operator such that the resulting parametrization has low distortion. And they gave a procedure to do this in the continuous case. And what we did is we then realized this algorithm in the discrete case for real data. So the construction procedure that they had is take candid eigenfunctions of the Laplace-Beltrami operator, then choose some arbitrary direction P1, and choose your first eigenfunction so that its gradient, the inner product with P1, is sufficiently large. And then you want to choose another direction so that you're able to find the gradient of another eigenfunction so that it is orthogonal or close to being locally orthogonal to the gradient of your first eigenfunction. And then you can do this in a sequential manner for higher dimensions. And when we want to do this in the discrete case, the challenge that we have is the estimation of the inner product of the gradient of the eigenfunction with this arbitrary direction P. Yeah.
There exists some I1, I2, so we don't know, it can be million. So we don't know that it's going to work. We can search a lot.
Yeah, so we have some kind of additional constraints that we've added in order to ease this selection process. So the first thing that we do is instead of it being an arbitrary direction, we'll have it actually be a gradient of one of the eigenvectors of the graph Laplacian. And then we still need to solve this problem of the inner product of the gradients of the eigenvectors locally. And for this, we build on a numerical estimation of local correlation in earlier work from Steinerberger. So Steinerberger in 2017 showed a local correlation between 2 eigenfunctions at a point. And then we showed that you could take the limiting value of the scaled local correlation. And if you take it to the limit, then you will get the inner product of the eigenvectors of the graph Laplacian at a point. And that this can be estimated by finite sum approximation of the integral. And just an example in synthetic data where we can actually calculate these, we compare the gradients of the eigenvectors locally to the numerical estimate that we get. And we can see that these align pretty well with each other. So we now have the ability to take the inner product of the gradients. I'll go only over the first part of our algorithm. So the first thing, as Gilad mentioned, how do we choose this subset of eigenvectors? What we first do is that we take gradients that have a sufficiently large, we take eigenvectors that have a sufficiently large gradient. So we want them to vary in some way over the neighborhood for the point that we're trying to find a parametrization. And then what we'll also do is that we'll take the low frequency eigenvectors. So we use our eigenvalues as some kind of proxy for how smooth the eigenvectors are. And then the first direction that we select then is a low frequency eigenvector that has a sufficiently large gradient. And I will take the inner product out of all the eigenvectors that we've selected at this point, and we'll choose the one that has a high inner product. And this will be our first direction. And then in order to select the subsequent ones, we want to take the gradient of the second eigenvector, find a gradient, so find an eigenvector whose gradient has a high inner product so that they're locally orthogonal. And then we can extend this to higher dimensions where instead of being just orthogonal to a single vector, you now need to be orthogonal to the span. So you need some higher order operators. not going to go into the details, they're all in the paper, but at each step, again, we're taking subsets of eigenvectors that have high gradient and that are also low frequency, so that they are varying, but that they're smoothly varying, they don't have a lot of oscillations, in order to form our locally orthogonal basis. And if we go again back to the square, let's say we're taking a point in this neighborhood, and this is the first eigenvector that's been selected for this neighborhood. We can see that it kind of smoothly varies along this point and has large gradient. This is the eigenvector that we select, and then these are just random eigenvectors chosen for the purpose of visualization. And we can see that the local neighborhood, so this subset of 25 points surrounding the point in the middle, if we use the eigenvectors that we've selected, indeed have low distortion, we get a nice evenly spaced grid. But if we were to take just random eigenvectors, then they kind of collapse on themselves. And this grid has now high distortion if we were to select, for example, the 8th eigenvector and the 14th eigenvector. So if we visualize this, for example, on the sphere, which is a slightly harder setting, what you'll see here on the left is the neighborhood kind of jump around. And then on the right, you'll see the parametrization of the local neighborhood in the selected eigenvectors that we find. And you can see what these eigenvectors look like at every point and which two pairs are being selected. So we can see that despite that we're using global eigenvectors, we are selecting them locally. So we're using a large set of eigenvectors. This is kind of different from what the classical approach in using spectral techniques for manifold embedding tells you, right? It tells you to take just the top k eigenvectors for spectral clustering or the top k eigenvectors in PCA or in diffusion maps and so on. Here we're allowing a much larger set of eigenvectors, and then we're choosing a subset of them at every point in order to get a local parametrization, building on this result from Jones, Maggioni, and Schul. And then the question is, now that we have these local parametrizations, so at each point we have a low distortion parametrization of the neighborhood, how do we get a global embedding out of it? So I have the local parametrizations of the neighborhood, and what we're going to leverage is that these neighborhoods actually overlap with each other. And we can leverage the overlap between the points in order to align the neighborhoods to each other and find a shared parametrization. So we can kind of rigidly align them, do a translation and a rotation using Riemannian gradient descent so that we end up with a global embedding of our manifold. And one way to pose this problem is that I take the points for which I have overlap. So these are the points that are observed in the ambient dimension. And we can see that for two different local views, I have a subset of points on which they overlap. And now I want to apply a rigid transformation to each of these, to the representation of the points in the two different views, and have the resulting embedding be as close as possible to each other, so that after alignment, there's very little alignment error between the representation under the two different views. And the reason that we're using a rigid transformation is because we don't want to introduce distortion, right? We've worked hard in order to get a low distortion embedding in the first step, and all we want to do now is to do a translation or a scaling and a rotation. A fine transform, which is what LTSA does, will introduce distortions because it's not preserving the aspect ratio of the points. And then a question that we have is, let's say I have a manifold with boundary, I can solve this problem. But if I have a manifold without boundary, like a torus, like a sphere, like a ring, then these red neighborhood over here aligns with this cyan light blue neighborhood, but it also aligns with this green neighborhood on the other side. And if I want to solve an alignment problem so that it has perfect alignment both with the points on the overlap here, but also with the points on the overlap here, I'm not able to do that in two-dimensional intrinsic coordinates. It would just collapse in the middle, similar to what we saw with UMAP and LTSA and so on. So we pose the problem slightly different so that we're able to tear manifolds in order to embed them in their intrinsic dimension. And the idea is that we start out with an over-torn embedding in intrinsic dimension, and then we're going to stitch it back together in an iterative manner. And the problem that we're solving now is that when we're aligning the points to each other, they're not neighbors only in the observation space, but they also need to already be neighbors in the embedding space after we've initialized them. So if I've aligned, for example, the red points with the light blue points, I'm not going to force them to also be aligned with the green points. So in order to solve this optimization problem, we define a bipartite graph between the points that belong to each local view. And from this, we can determine the overlaps between different local views. And then we can solve an optimization problem that is defined only in terms of the rigid alignment. We can extract the global embedding from this and defined in terms of this bipartite graph. So for a sphere, for example, we start out with some over-torn embedding using an initialization that we have. And then what we're iteratively going to do is if points are neighbors, again, both in the embedding space and also in the observation space, then we're going to solve the alignment problem for them. So this kind of stitches the over-torn embedding back to each other till we end up with a nice torn embedding of the sphere. And then, as I mentioned, I promised to you that you'd be able to tell apart flat Earth from ellipsoid Earth. So you'll notice that there is a coloring along the boundary of the torn embedding here. So this is a coloring of the tear so that I'm able to tell, oh, these yellow points are actually neighbors of these points in the ambient space. So I can reconstruct the sphere by tracing which points are neighbors of each other and in one direction along this torn boundary. Just to touch first on the alignment procedure itself and how we solve it. So we have a paper under revision at SIAM giving us some sufficient conditions for the uniqueness of the solution of this problem and necessary conditions also for non-degeneracy of finding a perfect alignment. So an alignment such that the views can be minimized with a zero alignment error. In the noiseless setting, which is obviously a very strong assumption, there exists a perfect alignment. We also have some new results for noise stability. You could see this in our newest version on arXiv. And then in order to solve this problem, we use Riemannian gradient descent, and we show that it converges locally linearly to a non-degenerate alignment. So you can solve this optimization problem using different techniques, Riemannian gradient descent, Procrustes analysis, SDP, spectral approaches. And what we found across a variety of idealized data sets for which we have ground truth is that Riemannian gradient descent both converges the fastest and to the lowest alignment error. So we can see that here with the embedding of a large aspect ratio rectangle, and we can see it here with a sphere and with a source roll with a hole. So for some of these, the algorithm doesn't even converge properly to a solution. So moving forward, we're using Riemannian gradient descent in order to solve this alignment problem. Now, as I mentioned, we're tearing the closed manifold. We're providing the user with the coloring of the boundary so that they know which points are neighbors. And what this allows us to do is to define a distance in intrinsic coordinates on our torn manifold. So if, for example, I have points xi and xj, and I want to be able to calculate the distance between them, but the tear goes through kind of the shortest path between them, what ends up happening in the embedding space is that their distance is not this red line from yi to yj going through the interior, but rather we have a tear-aware teleportation distance, we call this, where I travel from yi to the boundary, and then I teleport to the other side of the boundary and continue to yj. So this is the same as if I am now sailing from San Diego across the Pacific. I don't fall off the surface of the Earth, but rather I continue sailing on the other side of the atlas. So we can use this in order to do downstream analysis. Go back and forth. So for example, we can do topological data analysis on the manifold pair. So this, for example, is a torus. When it's torn into intrinsic dimensions, this is the embedding that we get. And following the arrows along the embedding, we get a gluing diagram that tells us, oh, these arrows actually allow us to recover a torus. We can validate this by applying topological data analysis, doing a persistence diagram, and we indeed find two co-cycles. The nice thing is that we can run TDA rather than on the entire data set. We can run it only on the points that belong to the tear in order to get the same result. And for this large data sets of tens of thousands of points, we can calculate this in 21 seconds versus 5 hours because we're only doing this along the points that belong on the tear. So we can see mapping the points on the tear to the 3D torus, we can also see these two cycles. This also allows us, by following the gluing diagram, to distinguish different topologies. So this, for example, is the embedding of a torus, but this is the embedding of a Klein bottle. So we're able to take non-orientable manifolds and embed them in their intrinsic dimensions, and we can tell them apart because here in this gluing diagram, the blue arrows are in opposite directions as opposed to the torus where we have the arrows going in the same direction. So this distinguishes the torus from the Klein bottle. So this gives us the global embedding. Again, it's an iterative process. We get a colored tear that tells us how to reconstruct the original topology and reconstruct a sphere versus a torus versus a Klein bottle. And this is across different kind of toy data sets, synthetic data sets. We have a barbell, a square with differently shaped cutouts, a sphere that isn't really closed. It has that kind of cap cut off at the top, or also a noisy Swiss roll. And we can see with our approach with LDLE that we're able to preserve, for example, the geometry of the two different cutouts so we can tell apart this diamond from the circle. We're able to handle noise. Again, this is a bit, it's a slightly older paper. So this is using the random initialization of Mishne where we can see across different data sets that it was tearing it apart. For the sphere, we can see that Mishne also kind of rips apart the manifold and embeds it in intrinsic coordinates, but because it doesn't have the coloring of the tear, I don't know if this was actually just a plane or a sphere or a torus. I don't know what this 2D shape is in the ambient dimensions. And then the question is, so this is all kind of qualitative. I'm showing you, oh, look at the beautiful pictures and we do better than others. But how can we actually judge for different embeddings the quality quantitatively of the embedding? So for this, we've developed a new distortion measure, which we call global distortion. Any questions so far, by the way? So I can show when we get to the empirical results in neuroscience that it's easier, for example, to decode from intrinsic dimensions because you just have immediately the parameter that you want to decode from. Whereas if you, for example, have a sphere or a circle, you now need to figure out what are the angular coordinates, recover those, and then try to do some kind of decoding, for example. So the distances you could still calculate as Euclidean in the global embedding space. Hop over the relevant slide. So what we do here is I have the distances within the interior, and to these distances, I add the distance within the local view that's low distortion that contains both of these points. So I can calculate in this way the distance between 2 points that are across the tear from each other. Right. So I'm not taking this red distance, but rather I'm taking this blue distance to the boundary. I then have a view that contains both of these points with low distortion. I'll take the distance there, and then I continue along from the boundary to this point. So for the point, you have to take kind of the minimum between either the distance in the interior or the distance with respect to the boundary. So you can calculate, again, this distance that takes into account the boundary and gives you the correct minimal distance that you should travel between 2 points. So I mentioned before distortion of local views of this worst case scenario of the product between expansion and contraction. And the question is, in our case, and we can also apply this to other embeddings, what about the distortion of the global embedding? So this only looks at points locally at their local neighborhoods. How distorted are they in the embedding space? Can we say something about the global embedding? So we defined 2 different measures of global distortion, which we call weak and strong global distortion. And what these do is, rather than take into account Euclidean distances in the embedding space, we're going to look at shortest path distances. And what we're going to see is how distorted is the shortest path between the observation space and the embedding space. And there are 2 ways that we do this. In the weak case, what we do is that we take the same sequence of points along the observation space, take that same path in the embedding space and calculate its distortion. For strong global distortion, we take the shortest path in the embedding space, and we see how distorted that is with respect to the observation space. So this is weak distortion, and this is strong global distortion. And what you can see is that strong global distortion indeed tells me that the distances, I gave the example before of China and Australia, has become severely distorted in this 2-dimensional projection of the Earth, for example. So we have also bounds on global distortion if we have a bottom-up manifold learning technique. And this bound is a measure of the maximum local distortion of all the local views. So for each local view, it has its own local distortion. And it's also a function of the alignment error of the global alignment procedure. So if we have an embedding for which we have low local distortion for all our views, and we've used a technique that gives us good global alignment, then the global distortion of our shortest path will be small. The assumption that we need in the case of strong global distortion is that the consecutive points on every shortest path in the embedding are neighbors in the data. So if I'm going along the shortest paths, all the points have to be also neighbors in the observation space. We have the same bound in the case of weak global distortion, but for this, we don't need the above assumption. A nice thing about the assumption is that it actually links us to a recent interest in the manifold learning community about attraction and repulsion. So Mishne and UMath have repulsion terms within the optimization problem that we're trying to solve. If we take the contrapositive of the assumption that we have, then what it tells us is that distant points in the data should also be far off in the embedding. And this gives us some inspiration for adding a repulsion term when we're embedding our data. So we can also solve an additional problem for repulsion-enabled registration. So we take the same problem that we're solving before. We're aligning all of our local views to each other. But then we also select for different points, points that are far away in the data, and we add this repulsion term. So we want these points to be far away from each other in the embedding itself. And we end up with an objective that is very similar to the previous objective, only now the Laplacian that we have is the Laplacian of the signed graph. So you can see that it has negative weights between points in the data. It's not only taking the bipartite graph that we had before, but the same optimization algorithms can be used. So we keep using Riemannian gradient descent in order to solve this problem. So here, for example, when we're trying to embed a torus, we can embed the torus in either 3 dimensions or in 2 dimensions. And if we embed it without repulsion in 3 dimensions, in our case, it also kind of collapses on itself in its weird way. But with repulsion, we're able to recover the toroidal shape. In 2 dimensions, we can see repulsion doesn't have an impact, and we're able to recover with the gluing diagram the toroidal intrinsic embedding in either case. And then we can use weak and strong distortion in order to measure these 2 embeddings to each other. And we can see for this first case where indeed there was some kind of collapse and it was a poor embedding, but we have very strong global distortion. So the geodesic distances are messed up. So we went out and tried to find manifolds in the wild. This is a data set from Letterman and Talmon. What they had was a video of 2 rotating dolls, a bulldog and a Yoda, and they each spin at different frequencies. And the intrinsic manifold then of embedding this video is a torus. So we can recover this torus in 2 dimensions and see with the gluing diagram that we have a toroidal structure. And we're also able to embed it with repulsion in 3 dimensions and get this kind of donut shape. We also, this isn't limited only to embedding data with intrinsic dimensionality of 2. So here, for example, we have a 3-sphere in 3-dimensional shape. And in this case, the tear is no longer a curve, but rather it becomes a plane, but we're still able to tear apart and show how this should be recovered in the observation space to recover a 3-sphere. So we can also embed data with higher intrinsic dimension. Non-orientable manifolds, I mentioned this already, but here's a real data example. So this is the conformation space of a cyclooctane, which apparently the embedding of this structure is a Klein bottle. So this is a real kind of chemical structure. And if we embed it in using LDLE, we can see that we recover a Klein bottle. This is comparing the embeddings of an ideal Klein bottle, comparing Tisny, UMAP, ISOMAP, and RATS, which I'll talk about. And we can use then global distortion in order to compare these techniques to each other. And we can see ISOMAP has pretty high global distortion, as LTSA, which isn't shown here. And with RATS, we get kind of the lowest distortion and are nicely able to recover the Klein bottle. So RATS has the same kind of framework with LDLE, only we've swapped out, as I mentioned earlier, rather than using the eigenvector construction, we use local PCA or local kernel PCA in order to get parametrization of the points, which leads me into the final part of the talk. How much time do I have left? 4 minutes? 9 minutes, okay. So with RATS, we've taken local view construction where we have either local PCA for every neighborhood or local kernel PCA if we want to be able to incorporate different distances, so not necessarily Euclidean distance. In neuroscience, a lot of times we'll use a cosine distance or a correlation distance to measure similarity of points. And we have a variety of applications to neuroscience data sets. So I mentioned in the beginning, manifold learning is kind of very popular right now in neuroscience in order to compare behaviors to each other, animals to each other, recover what is the underlying topology of different neural activity. So we started with some real-world data sets. I mentioned navigation circuits, and we've studied 3 different navigation circuits. So the first one is looking at this data set from Ela Fiet's lab, the study from Ela Fiet's lab, where they looked at the head orientation circuit. So this is a circuit, again, in animals that tells us which direction the animal is facing. And they showed in earlier work using isomap that they recover this kind of curved 3-dimensional structure that's a ring. And they can show this in both awake and in sleeping animals. So we compared a variety of manifold learning techniques on this data set. And with rats, because it's a 1-dimensional structure, a ring, we can embed it in only 1 dimension. We see that it's torn. And then it's very easy for us to get to your question, Will, to just decode from this to the angle of what the animal, what the direction the animal was facing. And we kind of get the lowest mean squared error. LTSA, which, as I mentioned, uses a fine transformation in order to do global alignment, distorts distances, and we can see that this corresponds to a higher mean squared error than other techniques. Another navigation circuit is called grid cells in medial entorhinal cortex. These are interesting neurons where they fire in a grid-like pattern based on where the animal is. So here the animal is what's called an open field. It's in a square environment. And this is the firing pattern of different cells mapped onto this environment. And you can see this kind of grid-like pattern. And there's been debate in the field on whether these cells, their activity lies on a torus. Whether the brain kind of implicitly has implemented a torus and how is it decoding from that torus, and so on. So in this work from Gardner et al., they used a combination of UMAP and TDA in order to recover a torus. So we again compared a variety of different techniques on our own technique rats, which again embedding an intrinsic dimension and then just using the boundary, we're able to apply TDA with a very fast runtime and find the torus in 2 dimensions and intrinsic dimensionality. And then you can map the firing rates of the neurons into this 2-dimensional intrinsic shape, where the grid pattern then becomes kind of a bump function that corresponds to the intrinsic parameters of this grid. And then another navigation circuit now in hippocampus. These are called play cells. They let a mouse walk around a maze, and the maze can be different shapes, T-shaped, a square, an H, a Y. And what play cells do, these are 3 different play cells, is that they fire in certain locations very, very sparsely. So one play cell will fire when I'm here, and another play cell will fire if I were to walk over to where Will is. And then we can use the population activity of these play cells in order to recover the space in which the animal was walking around and see what kind of distortion is incurred in the brain where we're doing this. But for this, we'd like our embedding to have low distortion to begin with. So this is a square maze, and this is our embedding using rats, and we can see the decoding of the X location and the Y location using our embedding, and we can see, for example, that the Y location has a smaller decoding error than the X location. We're still kind of studying this data set. This could be that there are more cells that are kind of tuned to where we are along the vertical axis rather than the horizontal axis. So we get a better decoding error. And then the last part, we were able to train a variety of recurrent neural networks in order to recapitulate certain neuroscience experiments. And what this allows us to do is to kind of change the intrinsic geometric parameters of the underlying manifold, introduce noise to the manifold, and measure distortion and decoding error. So this is a trace experiment, it's called. The animal is exposed to an air puff after a certain cue, and it kind of represents the timing of that stimuli. And due to the design of the RNN, we can kind of control what is the underlying geometry. So we could have, in this case, it's basically just, again, a rectangle, but we can control the aspect ratio of that rectangle. And we can see here that there's a bit of a branching point that most methods have a very hard time kind of disconnecting in the embedding. And we're able to just recover the intrinsic two-dimensional parameterization, and we have the lowest distortion error. So there's a few other RNNs in which we're also able to show kind of lowest distortion results, low decoding errors, and overall show that having low distortion corresponds to low decoding of behavior or stimuli, and so on. To summarize, so we introduce a new bottom-up manifold learning framework, constructing local views and aligning them together, where the local views can be constructed either through a subset of the eigenvectors of the graph Laplacian, or can be constructed using PCA or local kernel PCA, again, in order to just incorporate different distances. When we do the global alignment in order to get our embedding, we can obtain a torn embedding in intrinsic dimensionality. And then we've also introduced new distortion measures with corresponding bounds that can be used in order to compare how well do different methods represent the underlying geometry of the data. So how good are they at preserving the underlying geodesics when going from high dimensions to low dimensions. And then we've also introduced repulsion-enabled manifold learning. So using our distortion bound, we kind of have reasoning why repulsion is a good idea to be introduced. And we can then embed also not only an intrinsic dimension, but for example, embedding a torus in 3 dimensions with low distortion. In terms of future and ongoing work, things that we're looking at is local view construction under different noise models. So we've observed, for example, that under heteroscedastic noise, local PCA does rather poorly. We're developing a new technique now that is more robust to these kinds of noise settings. And then another thing that we're looking at, that we're interested in looking at, is hierarchical embeddings. So if I want to be able to kind of get a coarse view of the data down to a finer view of the data, this would both allow me to speed things up, just get kind of a coarse embedding of some landmarks of points, and then slowly zoom in on these and see what they look like locally. So I'd like to thank my collaborators, Drew, who has mainly led this work alongside Bas, and then Alex and Devika. Alex and I, if relevant to anybody, are recruiting a postdoc for an NSF-funded research. This is also with USC on geometry and deep learning. So if you're interested, please email me. I'd like to thank my funding agencies and my lab members and all of you for coming to the talk today. If anybody's interested in the code, it's under the PyLDLE2 package. Yeah.
Where you don't have intrinsic dimensionality. So I think you are going to get what might be a good intrinsic dimensionality.
Yes. Excellent question, as they say. So this is still kind of in low dimensions. We're still exploring these, but what we found is that if you take the data and embed it with increasing dimensionality using, for example, I think this was rats, but you can do this with other methods as well. Kind of global distortion gives you this kind of elbow that tells you what is the intrinsic dimensionality, or at least what's an upper bound on the intrinsic dimensionality. So we've kind of seen this in synthetic data, and we're still exploring using this. But you could think of it like a scree plot that you would get for PCA or the eigenspectrum for any kind of spectral approach. So we've not looked at that, but I think an interesting thing that we haven't actually explored and should be doable with our approach is data sets for which the intrinsic dimensionality actually varies based on where you are, and that would be a good use case. We could potentially, I guess, do kind of local distortion in local neighborhoods and check. We haven't done that, but that's a good idea. Yeah. Mhm.
What's the dimension of that?
Let me check. I don't have notes here, so I didn't save it for myself, but I mean, you can kind of see, right? It's hundreds, thousands of pixels is the kind of observed dimensionality, and with all of these neural data sets, it's typically dozens to hundreds of neurons. So every time point I have the activity of a population of cells, so the observed dimensionality is 60 or 120 or something like that. In order to do the embedding. So sometimes we kind of know from, in this case, we were trying to reproduce results from existing studies and show that we're able to obtain embeddings of the same dimension that they showed, or again, in order to embed a circle and the other method, you need 2 coordinates, we only need 1 coordinate. And then looking again at those synthetic examples, we're studying using distortion as a measure to determine what the dimensionality should be. Yeah, so again, you could run it for like an increasing number of dimensions and kind of see where your elbow is. In some cases, they have evidence. I think we've also seen, I actually can't recall if it was for this data set or for this data set that we kind of increase dimension, but the data kind of stays a torus. It's not that in the 3rd dimension, some noise starts happening or something like that. So you kind of see the low dimensional structure just embedded in a higher dimensional space. Yeah.
So the data point itself in the high dimensional space,
Mhm.
how does this change if you're given like pairwise estimates of the distance between points instead of the actual point location?
So you can use the LDLE version if you're going to do that, because that you can just convert to a similarity matrix. You can do then the graph Laplacian, get the eigenvectors, and run the whole approach. To do the RATS version, you need the original data in order to do local PCA or local kernel PCA, so that wouldn't work. I mean, in those embeddings, again, if you were to try to embed in intrinsic dimensions, they mostly just collapse on each other. Then you can also color them in some way and preserve. Sure. I mean, we've mostly been kind of playing around the framework, right, is kind of modular. How do you construct your local views? What kind of algorithm do you do for global alignment? So we've been playing around with that mostly. How do you initialize has also been a question that has come up recently as impacting results. I'm not sure in Mishne. We kind of keep track of who are the points that are neighbors in the ambient space, but not neighbors in the embedding space via this bipartite graph that we have in our construction. I think you just need to incorporate, yes, some kind of object that is tracking that, I guess, because Mishne does seem to be able to do this tearing, or at least the older version of Mishne does. I guess you'd have to modify somehow the attraction term in Mishne and UMAP in order to enable this tearing. So that you could probably modify the attraction term to be similar to ours. That given the initialization, points are attracted only if they're already close to each other, I guess, or some kind of decaying weight or something like that. I feel like you should be able to modify it.